Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kara Solomon, and I'm a conservation coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. We're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit dedicated to protecting, conserving, and restoring wildlife and habitat in North Carolina. And tonight I am here with one of our community wildlife chapters, the Southway Conservationists. We're excited to be joining you from various parts of Wake County and across the state. So thank you so much for joining us. I will be your moderator for this evening. So if you have any questions at any point during the presentation, you can type them in the chat or type them in the Q&A feature, and I will read them out to our speaker at the end. So again, we'll save questions to the end, but feel free to type them in and put them in the chat as you think of them, and I will keep track of those. So we will get those questions answered at the very end. All right, so I am going to turn things over to the president of the Southway Conservationists, Monty Murray, to get us started. So go ahead and take it away, Monty.
All right. Thank you, Kara. Can you hear me okay? All right.
Yes.
And can you see the slide okay?
Yes.
All right, good. So, good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're really happy to have everybody here this evening. We've got a great program tonight. Um, I see we've got about, I don't know, 150 people or so signed up for this webinar, which is fantastic. We got people from all over North Carolina. We have people from Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee, New York, Alabama, and California. So pretty cool. Glad to see the interest. I think this is a pretty intriguing topic. But before we get into that, I'd like to do a little quick update on things that are going on in the chapter because we have a lot of activities that we do, throughout the month. And let's give you an update on near-term activities coming up. And then I'll turn it over to Sissy McKissick, who's the Programs and Education Committee Chair, who will introduce our speaker. So just a few things on the agenda coming up soon. Actually, this Saturday, we're going to be going to Chapel Hill to the North Carolina Botanical Gardens, and we'll be doing a seed cleaning workshop, which is something we've not done before. So we're pretty excited about doing that. Unfortunately, that is full, so we don't have any more openings to go. So I'm just letting you know, if you did sign up, great. I think you'll love it. If you didn't, hopefully we'll be able to do it again another time. We've got a bald eagle watch coming up at Jordan Lake on February 21st. And that's going to be led by one of our members, Jeremy Bach, who's quite an ornithologist in the team. We're going to be doing more invasive removals. This is something we do on a pretty much an ongoing basis. This one is going to be at Hemlock Bluffs Nature Preserve. We're going to be tackling a patch of bamboo, and that is on February 28th. We then have our in-person meeting next month, which will be at Bass Lake Park here in Holly Springs, which is where we're based. And it's about the indigenous conservation ethic in relation to wildlife, a Tuscarora historical and cultural perspective. So that's going to be really interesting to see the Native American connection to conservation. It's by David Rahahe T. Webb. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Who is an award-winning author. He's an artist, he's a conservationist, he's a historian, and he's a citizen of the Tuscarora Indians. So that's on March 5th, and it'll include a book signing. So that's here in Holly Springs. That's next month. And then we have a spring ephemerals walk. So that's always a delight to go to Swift Creek Bluffs Nature Preserve, which is from the Triangle Land Conservancy properties. That'll be held on March 7th, and it'll be led by Dr. Eric Pauly, who is a great guide for natural plants, and it'll be fun to see the new ephemerals emerging. And then finally, we do participate in public events, and this one coming up is on March 21st. It's at Beach Bluffs County Park. It's called the this is hard to say, Beach Bluffs Bash. And so we'll be doing an exhibit there. So if you're able to come, it's a great nature-oriented festival, but we'll be one of the exhibitors there. So come if you can. I'll encourage you to subscribe to our website. You'll see it there on the bottom of the screen. Watch our calendar. Join us for any activities, ones that you're interested in. All are welcome, and the more the merrier. So that's a few things coming up. I'd like to now turn it over to Sissy McKissick.
Hey. Hello, everyone. We're glad you're all here, and we're thrilled to have Gabriela with us this evening. She's with us tonight to deepen our understanding of the vital role insects play in the health of our gardens, state, and planet. Gabriela is the Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. She works with developers, consultants, and government agencies to produce ecologically friendly guidance that minimizes impacts to wildlife and priority habitat in a developing landscape. In addition, in 2017, she formed the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, a partnership that works to promote pollinator and habitat conservation across the state. And we are glad to have you here, Gabriela. Thank you for being here.
All right. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. How does that look?
It's good.
Perfect. Okay. So again, my name is Gabriela Garrison, and I'm so happy to be here. And I want to preface this presentation by saying that this is really just the tippy tip of the iceberg when talking about pollinators, predators, any beneficial insects in North Carolina. So this is just kind of, we're dipping our toes. There's so much more to learn. I could talk for an entire 3 days on all the really cool beneficial insects in North Carolina, but hopefully this will give an overview and make you excited to learn more about them. So with that, let's just dive right in. So I really like doing in-person presentations because then I can ask the audience questions and make some good eye contact and kind of keep you guys awake. But I'm also happy to have the opportunity to do virtual. But if I ask you something, maybe just say it in your living room or your kitchen, and we'll see if we come up with the same answer. So I always like to ask folks, how many insect species are there out there in this whole world? So maybe just shout out loud to yourself and answer, and we'll see if it's about the same as what I come up with. Let's see if I can get there we go. All right, so if you came close to 1.5 million species, then you're pretty on tap with what the amount described has been. But how many more are actually awaiting description? So 1.5 million seems like a lot, but when you think about all the insects in this world, is it really that much? How many more are there? Well, entomologists, scientists think that there are at least 5.5 million species. So that's a lot more insects that are waiting to be discovered and described. What about insects in the United States? 91,000 species. But again, the actual count is likely much higher. And we'll talk about this as we go through the presentation, but insects are actually really hard to study because they're really elusive. A lot of insects are only active to our eyes above ground out of their nesting or overwintering habitat for a really short period. So it can be really hard to figure out what the species are, what they're doing, what their preferences are. But insects are really important. They are a major component of biodiversity. And with that, they account for 80% of animal life on the planet, which again is a really huge number. So I always feel like insects are understated, underappreciated, and they provide so much for us. They do a lot of really important jobs for us, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But before we jump to that, I always like to point out kind of the 2 different stages or the 2 different life cycles that insects go through. They either have complete metamorphosis, which is maybe what we're most familiar with butterflies and bees. They have 4 stages in their life. They're an egg, and then they become a larva or a caterpillar. And then they turn into a chrysalis or a cocoon if you're a moth. And then they become an adult. So those are 4 stages. But then we have a lot of insects also that undergo incomplete metamorphosis, where they only have 3 stages. So they start as an egg, and then they turn into what we call a nymph, which is kind of like a similar appearance as an adult, but they're usually smaller and they lack wings. And that's not across the board. That's just kind of a generalized description, but they're a nymph and then they become an adult. And as a larva and as a nymph, they often go through several stages of growth, which we call instars. So if you've heard about caterpillars being in the first instar or the third instar, that's a different level of growth for that stage in their life. So that is relevant when we're talking about holometabola or hemimetabola. So if you look here at this chart, which I really love, but it can be a little bit overwhelming too, I acknowledge that. These are all of our insects in this circle, but you can see that the holometabolous insects make up a little more than 75%. And the holometabolous insects are the ones that undergo that complete metamorphosis, right? That have the 4 different stages in their life cycle. And so those are the Lepidoptera. Right here are moths and butterflies. The Diptera are flies, Hymenoptera, the wasp, the bees, the ants, and the sawflies, and then the Coleoptera, which are our beetles. And by the way, make up the largest percentage of this circle. Really, really, really diverse order, the Coleoptera. And then this little piece of the pie right here, those are the insects that undergo that incomplete metamorphosis. Remember, we just talked about they have 3 life stages instead of 4 in that cycle of development. And an example of some of those insects are aphids, cicadas, assassin bugs, one of my favorites, are such good hunters, leafhoppers, things of that nature. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward, which is why I kind of wanted to introduce that. But hopefully you'll think that this is as cool of an image as I do, even if it is a little bit busy. All right, so we tend to separate insects into 4 kind of general categories. The pollinators, the decomposers, the predators, and then the food for wildlife category. And today we're going to put a little bit more focus on the pollinators and the predators, but I didn't want to leave out the decomposers because they're a really important group. And I also really wanted to emphasize how important insects are as food for other wildlife. So we're going to jump into first the decomposers. Like I said, we're just going to kind of touch on the decomposer category and the food for wildlife, and then we're going to go to predators and pollinators. So decomposers, really, really important. They feed on dead animals. They feed on the poop of other animals. They feed on all kinds of things in your garden to break them down, the leaves, the woody debris. They're really, really important for cycling all of those nutrients. And when you think about all of these critters in the ground, what's another reason that they're really important? What are they doing in the ground that's really important? They're making tunnels. They're working through the soil. They're aerating the soil. They're moving all those nutrients around. So I think that's a really important job that a lot of people tend to forget because we don't see that, right? That's happening underground. So again, underappreciated, but an incredibly critical job. And so an example of some decomposers are beetles, ants, fly larvae, mites, springtails, all of these critters that play this role that we have to be able to sustain our ecosystem. So I thought I'd give a few examples of decomposers before we jump to the next category, the American burying beetle. So this is where if I was in person with you guys, I would ask you to raise your hands if anybody has ever seen one of these. I have never seen one. They are not present in North Carolina anymore that we know of anyway. They have disappeared from 90% of their range. They are the largest carrion beetle in North America, and they're nocturnal. And so here's a picture of one right here. They have this really unique orange spot on their pronotum, and you can see they're pretty large, right? I mean, this is somebody's hand. So the really cool thing about American burying beetles is that they can detect a dead animal from 2 miles away, this tiny little bug, which is pretty impressive, I think. And so another kind of thing that's unusual about these insects is that the male and the female, they work together to care for their young. That's not very common in insects. Oftentimes, it's the female that cares for the young, and the males, their only role is for breeding, for mating. So this mated pair will cooperatively find a carcass. They'll burying it. They will bury it. That's hence the name burying beetle. And then they roll that carcass into a brood ball, and then they lay eggs on the brood ball, the female does, and the eggs hatch, and then that's how they are sustained on that carcass on the brood ball. So it's a really neat critter. If you have seen one, drop it in the chat and let me know where you saw it, because it'd be a cool thing to see. All right, so another example of some decomposers that we would actually see here in North Carolina are dung beetles. We have over 30 species, and they do exactly what they're called. They roll balls of dung to use as food, as nurseries for their young, and even as mobile homes. And they're pretty small. They have a range of sizes, but overall they're pretty small. And the neat thing about them is that they can push things that are 1,000 times their weight. I know I see them a lot in my backyard because I have dogs and they poop in the backyard. And so often the dung beetles find their poop pretty quickly, and they do roll balls and push it in all different directions. And so one of the things that I love about this that I don't think people realize is that that's really good for seed dispersion. We talk a lot about how seeds get moved from one spot to another. A lot of birds move them, but we don't often think about beetles being good seed dispersers. Another example that we have here in North Carolina are blowflies. We have 24 species, maybe more, but 24 species at least here. And one cool thing about them is that they can locate carrion from miles away, which again, you have this tiny little fly that's about the size of a housefly that can smell from such a long distance. And I don't have this picture that I included, but the larvae, which are right here on the right side of the screen, they have these mouth hooks, which are really big on the end of the larval area right here that they use to break apart the tissue. So maggots are another common name for the larvae. And so they're really important. And they, once the egg is laid, they usually hatch within 24 hours, and they have a pretty rapid life cycle. So they're very vital for breaking down dead animals, for disappearing them from the surface. And so the adults don't tend to eat the carrion, but they can feed on nectar, pollen, and sap. So a lot of times we do classify flies as pollinators. Okay, so moving on to the next category, food for wildlife. Caterpillars are an incredibly valuable source of food for wildlife. I feel like a lot of people probably know that. There's been a lot of attention on that recently, just because over 90%, almost 95% actually, of North American land birds feed insects to their young. That's critical for their development. But sometimes when I'm talking to folks that do a lot of hunting that might not think that there's as much importance on pollinators, I like to remind them that for baby turkeys and baby quail, insects are the primary dietary component. So again, very important to have insects for those birds, for game birds and for songbirds and land birds alike. So who here has heard of Dr. Doug Tallamy? He has written a lot of books. He's done a lot of webinars. He's done a lot of presentations. I know in North Carolina, he's come to quite a few places to do in-person presentations. If you have not heard of Dr. Doug Tallamy, then you have a homework assignment for this weekend. Go to your bookstore, go to your library, go online and buy one of his books. They're really digestible. They're really informational and easy to read. And so he's done a lot of studies looking at the importance of insects and the role that they play in the ecosystem. And he did a study with a graduate student in Washington, D.C., looking at the importance of caterpillars for songbirds in these urban suburban areas. And they were basically following around pairs of chickadees to see how they were rearing their young. Because on average, nestlings eat one caterpillar every 3 minutes. So baby chickadees aren't in the nest for that long, only about a little under 3 weeks. But in that time, in about 18 days, 18 to 21 days, they will consume up to 9,000 caterpillars for one nest of chickadees. That's crazy, right? So in this urban suburban neighborhood in Washington, D.C., Dr. Tallamy and his graduate students were going around doing an assessment of all of the trees in that area to see how sustainable it was for these chickadees to exist. And this is what they found. On a white oak tree, they found 15 different species of caterpillars and a total of 233 caterpillars. That's pretty good, right? That makes it a little bit easier to sustain a nest of chickadees. On a black cherry tree, they found 10 species and 53 caterpillars. Again, pretty good. But on a calorie pear, on an ornamental pear, they found 1 species and 1 caterpillar. But let's be real, that caterpillar wasn't eating those leaves because that's a non-native invasive tree. some bird or something must have accidentally dropped a caterpillar, or the caterpillar got lost going onto that tree. And the really unfortunate thing is that when they were doing surveys in that neighborhood, the majority of trees were those ornamental pears. So those birds probably had really poor success raising any young because there were so few caterpillars that they were able to provide to their young. So caterpillars play a critical role. And in some of Doug Tallamy's books, he'll talk about they've done these surveys in other large urban areas and some large cities, and they have found that within the city limits, even though they might be qualified as a tree city, almost all of their trees are non-native, so they have very few caterpillars on them. And within the city limits, they found that the bird life is very low. There's not much diversity, there's not much abundance, but when they leave the city limits and they go into wild areas or protected areas, that's when they start seeing all the bird diversity. So caterpillars are really crucial for wildlife. So this is a picture in the woods back behind my house. And I want you to take a look and see what looks a little bit out of the ordinary. I'll give you a clue. So we were walking in the woods and it was a November day and it wasn't terribly cold, but we saw this giant hole in the ground and we saw all this kind of nest-like material. It wasn't honeycomb, but it kind of looked like comb material, like little cells where there might be larvae. And we were trying to figure out what was happening from a distance, and we approached. And what do you think we saw? Something that would interest these mammals here on the left. What it ended up being was a yellow jacket nest, and they were still sort of active because in November, sometimes it's not too terribly cold yet. But what had happened was that probably in my neck of the woods where I live, it was a raccoon that had dug up the yellow jacket nest because all of those larvae were incredibly high in protein. So bee wasp and ant larvae can contain up to 77 grams of protein per 100 grams of weight. So that's 3/4 protein. So the stings that that raccoon got from the yellow jackets were probably pretty minimal for the worth of the protein that it got from digging up that nest. And that happens a lot too. I used to have a swing set in my backyard, and carpenter bees got into the swing set. And that was not the detriment of the swing set. It was when the pileated woodpeckers came down and pecked out the carpenter bees that were in the swing set because of that protein, that larval protein value. That's what ended up doing in the swing set. So a lot of value for a lot of different species of wildlife for these insect larvae. Okay, so now we're going to move on to one of my favorite categories, predators. There's so many cool examples, but native predator and parasitoid insects provide ecological pest control services estimated to be worth at least 4.5 billion. And if that's an estimate, then we know that the number is actually probably higher. But 4.5 billion is already an insanely high number. So that's a lot of worth right there. Another reason that's good to have these native predators is they reduce the need for insecticides. And most importantly, they reduce the need to release non-native insects, which can really affect the balance of the ecosystem. And we're seeing that in a lot of different places now. Which spotted lanternfly wasn't necessarily released as a predator, but we're seeing the effects of a lot of these insects that aren't supposed to be here. So this is just an example of some of the different categories of predators that we might find here in North Carolina. Lots of the assassin bugs, which I said are my favorite. This was a soldier bug over here. It kind of cut off the bottom of the picture, but I had monarch caterpillars in my yard one year, and they were really small. They were maybe only second instar caterpillars, maybe third instar. And the soldier bug had found my caterpillar, and they're part of the family or the class of true bugs. So they have these kind of sucking mouth parts, and they insert it into their prey, and they literally suck the liquid out of it, which is kind of gross, but really cool at the same time. So when this soldier bug was done with my caterpillar, it looked like it was just a shell of the caterpillar because the bug had sucked out all the innards. So really efficient predators. So I thought that we would talk about just a handful, just a few. One of my favorites, green lacewings. Has anybody seen this on their plants in the spring or the summer? I tend to see these on my milkweed all the time. Has anybody seen those? So this is the leaf of a plant, and these are the eggs suspended from these little threads for protection. So that's the egg. This is the larval form of green lacewings. Has anybody seen that on their plants? Again, I see that on my milkweed all the time, and it makes me really excited because they eat aphids. So the larvae of these lacewings, sometimes called aphid lions because they're so aggressive towards aphids, they can consume up to 200 aphids per week. This one little larval creature, 200 aphids. Sign me up for that. And this is the adult form of the green lacewing, which I also see on my plants, but I really like seeing the larva because that's where the power is at. And people often ask me in the summertime, they see those orange aphids on the milkweed and they want to know how to get rid of them. And sometimes you can take your finger if you don't want to apply pesticides, which is the best way to go. Or even neem oil, I try to avoid that. You can take your fingers and just try to knock off the aphids, but you have to be really careful when you do that because on my milkweed, I see a whole host of different predators that are going after the aphids. And if you ever see on your plants little black aphids, those are aphid mummies. So that means that that's an aphid that's been predated on by the larva of a lacewing or the larva of a ladybug. Lots of really good predators out there. So let's talk about praying mantis. Hopefully everybody has seen one of these in your yard. This is the Carolina mantid, not to be confused with the Chinese mantid. So a lot of people ask how to distinguish between the two. Honestly, I see more of the Chinese mantids than I see of the Carolina mantids, unfortunately. The Chinese mantids are, they're insatiable. They're good predators, but they eat everything. They have voracious appetites. They're really large. I've seen them in the woods eating just about everything. I know that there are pictures circulating sometimes of Chinese mantids that have gotten hummingbirds on a hummingbird feeder. I've seen lots of things in the woods, but people always ask me how to distinguish between the Carolina mantis and the Chinese mantis. I don't know that color is the best way to do it because I've seen kind of greenish looking Carolina mantids, but I've also seen kind of brown mottled looking Chinese mantids. So I find that the best way is to look at their wings. On the Carolina mantid, the wings only go down about 2/3 of the way of the abdomen. And on the Chinese mantids, the wings extend the full length. And then you can also look at their face plates, but sometimes that's hard to tell. The Chinese mantids have a square plate, and then the Carolina mantids have a more rectangular plate. But it's curious because we try to protect the Carolina mantids just because those are our native insects and that's what we want. And those are also really voracious predators that do a good job of eating our crop pests. All right, then the last one I'm going to talk about, which might be one of my favorite wasps. I don't know. I have a lot of favorite wasps, but cicada killer wasps are amazing. So they're really large. They're one of our largest, probably our largest native wasp in North Carolina that can be up to 2 inches in length, which is pretty big. And they're solitary. So they hunt cicadas exclusively for the young. Wasp adults are not carnivorous. You'll see wasp adults that are nectaring on flowers and collecting pollen sometimes, but mostly nectar, but they feed meat to their young. So in this case, the cicada killer wasp, they collect cicadas to feed to their young. So our photographer, she's retired now from WRC, she caught a series of these amazing pictures. So you can see here that this female is inserting her stinger, her modified ovipositor into the cicada to paralyze it. That's how they get their prey to feed to their young. So she paralyzed it with venom, and then she was dragging it back to her underground burrow because they nest in the ground. And then she'll lay an egg on the cicada, and when the egg hatches, it'll feed on the cicada. And what's really cool about cicada killer wasp is that you can see that the cicada is clearly larger than this female, right? So a lot of times they will climb up a tree with the cicada and then they'll glide down a distance towards their nest to get closer to their nest, because it's really hard, almost impossible for them to actively fly with the cicada. So they'll climb up a tree, glide down, climb up another tree, glide down until they get back to their nest with their cicada. So a really, really cool species to see, usually in the later part of the summer in July or August. And we get calls sometimes because people want to think that these are the Asian giant killer hornets, but they're not. They're very benign, and the females, they do not want to sting you. They just want to go along and do their business. All right, so now we're going to shift to pollinators, and we have a pretty nice pollinator diversity in North Carolina. We have over 550 species of native bees. We have over 2,800 species of moths. We have 178 species of butterflies. We have our hummingbird, of course, and then we have an unknown number of other insect pollinators, wasps, flies, beetles. But you can see now that there's a lot of overlap, right? Because we already said that flies and beetles can be in that predatory category, right? We said that beetles could also be in that decomposer category. So you have a lot of these insects kind of performing 2 and 3 different roles, which is really cool and shows how important they are in balancing our ecosystem for good ecosystem health. So I always like to point out that bees and flies and wasps can look similar on the wing, especially if they're similar colors. So I wanted to take a moment to explain some of the differences. So maybe this spring and summer, if you're out in your yard, you can determine easily which is a bee versus a fly versus a wasp. So this first image on the left is a bee. And one of the easier ways to distinguish is that they have pollen collecting hairs, usually on their legs, usually on their bodies. Oftentimes, different species will have it on the underside of their abdomen right here. But if they're pretty furry and fluffy and robust, that usually means it's a bee. Their pollen collecting hairs are branched. They kind of look like feathers if you look at them under a microscope. And on the next slide, I actually have a picture of what that looks like so you can get an idea of how complex they are. This next critter is a fly. And flies can be pretty easy to distinguish because they have what we call fly eyes, these really big eyes right here that take up more than a half of their head. You can see on the bee that the eyes are only about a half size of their head, maybe smaller depending on the species, and the same for the wasp. So flies have these really big eyes. They have these short little nubby antennae. See how on the bee that has this nice long antenna, same for the wasp. And then the other difference, which is not always as noticeable as the eyes, is that they only have 2 wings. Wasps and bees have 4 wings, 2 wings on each side, but bee or flies only have 1 wing on each side. And then finally, we get to our wasp. They have usually kind of the smoother, skinnier, sort of streamlined appearance. And they have what we've kind of described, what we've coined as the wasp waist, where at the connection of their abdomen and thorax, it gets really thin and then it bows back out. Bees don't tend to have that. They're pretty compact, robust little bricks, which I like to call them. But, you know, I have to say, not all wasps are like that. Sometimes we have wasps that do have some hairs on their abdomen, on their thorax. So, you know, Mother Nature likes to keep us guessing. There's never an exact statement that you can say. There's usually always an exception to the rule. So let's talk a little bit about our native bees. They come in a wide range of sizes, shapes, colors, different foraging habitats, different nest behavior. So I really like this poster here that's done by the authors of The Bees in Your Backyard, which is a really great book if you want to learn more about native bees. And so, of course, these sizes are not accurate to the size of the bee, but what they are accurate to is their size in relation to each other. So the bee over here, the carpenter bee and the bumblebee, are much larger than a lot of our other bees. They're mason bees, sweat bees, so on and so forth. So female bees, they gather pollen to feed their young, to feed their babies, and they themselves will feed on nectar because that's sort of like their energy drink, for lack of a better way of saying it. It has all the carbs and amino acids to keep them going, to give them energy. But pollen is really the essential nutrient for their larval development. And that's because it has proteins, minerals, vitamins, lipids. It has all the things needed for those little baby bees to go through all of those different stages of development. And so with most of our bees, they're solitary, and it's the female that's doing all the work, that's collecting all of the pollen. And so, like I mentioned, they have these branched hairs on their bodies, and this is a microscopic image of what those branched hairs look like. And that's why they're so efficient, because the pollen clings to that really well. So they're able to collect it as they're visiting flower to flower, and then they go back to their nest and they groom it, they kind of comb it off of them, and they make what we call a pollen ball. It's mostly pollen, but it's woven together with nectar, kind of like as the source to make it one solid unit, one solid ball. And they deposit that in a chamber for their young. They lay an egg on the pollen ball. And when the egg hatches, the larval form of that bee will consume the pollen and then start its phases of development. So a few other fun facts about bees. They are descended from wasps. So we call bees our vegetarian wasp because they only eat pollen and nectar. Whereas, like I mentioned before, wasps will eat pollen and nectar as adults, but they feed their young some form of meat. And then another fun fact that a lot of people don't know is that male bees cannot sting. Male wasps cannot sting, male ants cannot sting. Anything in the order Hymenoptera, only females can sting. They have that modified ovipositor that acts as a stinger, but males don't have that. So let's just talk a minute about their nesting habits. I mentioned this, that 70% of native bees are ground nesters. So if you're out walking in the spring, it really won't be long from now, since we're already in February, within the next month or so, when we start having warm days, you might be out and you'll see these little burrows, commonly mistaken for ant mounds, but these are actually the burrows of solitary bees that are ground nesters. 70% of them are ground nesters. And these might be bees like mining bees, cellophane bees, sweat bees, lots of different variety. And especially in the spring, that's when they tend to emerge. And this is a diagram of what their underground burrows look like. So the female, she'll excavate this tunnel and she'll make little individual chambers, and she'll drop the pollen ball in each chamber. And then when she's done creating this, she'll go back to the top, she'll seal off the top. So she'll seal off this hole, and then she'll die. And these bees, once the egg hatches and consumes the provisions, they'll develop. And then the following year, they'll dig up to the surface and the whole cycle will start over again. And what's pretty cool is that after a month or so, once she seals off this entrance, between rain and this and that, you don't even see that these were present anymore. So people always call me in the spring and sometimes the summer, and they're freaking out, right? Because they see these burrows in their front yard or on their property, and they see bees hovering around them. And guess what their first inclination is to do? It's usually to pour gasoline in the hole, or it's to pour water in the hole, or it's to do something like till up the area to get rid of it. So we have to go through this process of explaining to them that these are native bees and we really like them. And within a month, you won't even know that they're there. But it's kind of cool thinking about once, that time has passed and those burrows have been closed, and between rain and wind, and they've kind of, been blown away, the tops of it. It's neat to think about when you're walking on the ground, you're walking over hundreds of all these little developing bee babies. To me, that's pretty cool to think about. But the difference between the solitary bee burrows and a yellow jacket nest is that you're going to see multiple yellow jackets coming and going from one entrance. Whereas with a solitary bee burrow, you're only ever going to see one bee, one insect coming and going from that burrow. So that's an important distinction, so that we don't confuse the solitary bee burrow with the yellow jacket burrow, which can be a little bit more dangerous. All right, so I already kind of touched on this, so we'll just go through the life cycle really quick. Here you have the female bee. She's collecting pollen and nectar for her brood. And then this is her burrow underground, and she's dropped the pollen ball on there, and she'll lay an egg on the pollen ball. The egg will hatch and become a larva, and it'll start eating that pollen ball, those provisions, and then eventually it'll pupate into a pupa, and then it'll go through sometimes pre-pupal development. Eventually it will complete its metamorphosis and climb to the surface, and the cycle will start over again with an adult bee foraging out and about. And like I said, the female, she's doing all of the provision collecting. The male, his only purpose for being alive above the surface is to mate with the female. So his lifespan tends to be a little bit shorter than a female. He might only be alive for 2 or 3 weeks, whereas the female could be alive between 4 and 6 weeks because she's got a lot more work to do. So what about the other 30%? Of bees, we said 70% are cavity nesters. What about the other ones? I'm sorry, 70% are ground nesters. So the remaining 30% are cavity nesters. And we think about cavity nesters as mason bees, as leaf cutting bees. Those are the bees that oftentimes excavate their nest in hollow or pithy stems, like this bee right here. And this is the cross section of a stem that was used as a nest for a bee. And it's kind of the same concept as the ground nesters. You have this pollen ball that the female has provisioned. Each pollen ball, each egg has its own chamber. You can see it separated here by these 2 walls. And then they go through the same phases of development where the egg hatches, it becomes a larva, then it becomes a pupa, and then it becomes an adult. And then, of course, we have our bumblebees, which I actually had an image of a bumblebee life cycle, but that's really going down a rabbit hole, bumblebee life cycle and the bumblebee life and their habits. So I thought I would just mention, I would leave it at that. So I didn't talk too much about bumblebees, but they are one of our few truly social bees. And this is what their colony looks like. They tend to have anywhere between 50 to 150 different bees in their colony. And they have these wax pots, and the provisions are dropped in the wax pots and the eggs are laid on top of the wax pots. And if anybody has ever seen a bumblebee colony, that's really cool. I'm always looking for them. They're usually hidden in places that are kind of out of the way. A lot of times people have found them in abandoned rodent burrows because of the location. It's really hidden, but it still has easy access to the surface. And some scientists think that they like those rodent burrows because there's still hair left from the mice or the rats or whatever was using it. And especially in the spring when it's still a little bit cold outside, they like having that heat from the fur. So it's pretty cool to think about it that way. But I do want to mention that bumblebees are very significant pollinators of a lot of different agricultural crops. And I included some of the more common ones here just so you can see how important they actually are. But they're generalist feeders. So they'll go to a lot of different flowers. They'll visit a lot of flowers, which that's what makes them so valuable because they do carry pollen from so many different species from one destination to another. And they're also really fun to look at and really fun to follow. A lot of people call them big fuzzy teddy bears because they're rather large and they're really, really furry, as you can see in these pictures here. We actually have a citizen science project called the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, which is all about taking pictures of bumblebees and tracking where they're located and what the species are. So if you're interested in being involved in that community science project, please reach out to me because I'd love to tell you more about that project. So we're going to jump from bees to Lepidoptera now to butterflies and moths. And this is just a really quick and easy diagram of the life cycle of a moth. So again, they have that complete metamorphosis where they have 4 stages in their life cycle. They start with an egg. The egg hatches to a caterpillar or a larva. It becomes a cocoon, which the difference between moths and butterflies is that butterflies, the larva turns into a chrysalis, not a cocoon, but then ultimately it emerges as an adult. So I love, love, love moths. I think they're really underappreciated and so interesting and so diverse. And even though moths and butterflies are in the same order, there are quite a few differences between them. Probably one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is that moths have lots of different or varied antennae rather. They tend to be kind of feathered and look brushy, whereas butterflies, they have what looks just like a single antenna, and there's a little club on the end of it. So you can see in this picture here, has like this little club. And with this Luna moth, you can't see it as well, but it's kind of feathered look to it. So that's a pretty easy way to distinguish. Moths tend to have really thick and fuzzy bodies. Butterflies tend to have thinner, smoother bodies, but I've seen some skippers and some other butterflies that look pretty fuzzy and fluffy. So that's not always a really reliable way. Moths tend to be active at night and butterflies active during the day. But always an exception because we do actually have quite a few moths that are diurnal, that are active during the day. I already mentioned moths make a cocoon, butterflies make a chrysalis, and then oftentimes when moths are at rest, their wings are open, and butterflies, when they're at rest, like in this picture, their wings are closed. But again, there's always exceptions to the rule because I've seen both flip-flopped, where moths, their wings are closed, and vice versa, their butterflies, their wings are open. Mother Nature likes to keep us guessing, right? So I would be remiss if I didn't put in a slide about moths because they are just amazing insects. Like I said, incredible diversity. We have at least 2,800 species just in North Carolina, probably a lot more. And there's a lot of recent research now suggesting that they might be as efficient at pollinating as our native bees are, which we always called our native bees our pollinating powerhouses, right? But moths might be as efficient. Some research is starting to show. One study found that moths visit more plant species than native bees do. So that makes them a really important vector for moving pollen from one area to the next. And again, like I said, they're really diverse. So they have the capacity to really be able to capture pollen and visit a lot of flowers. Moth-pollinated flowers are often light-colored or white, and that's because they reflect the moonlight and make them easier to see for the moths in the darkness. But moths also have a strong sense of smell for feeding and for reproduction alike. So they smell the flowers. A lot of the flowers they visit have really strong odors, but they also smell the pheromones that the females emit that enables them to find them a little bit easier, especially in the darkness. So I could go down a rabbit hole easily with moths. Love them. So let's talk about what are some of the factors affecting not only native bee populations, but most insects. It's kind of a death by a thousand cut situation. So insecticides are an obvious one, but other pesticides too, we're finding are having a lot of detrimental effects on insects. Think about neonicotinoids. Those have proven to be very detrimental. They get into the plant parts, the pollen, the nectar, the leaves, and then when the insects eat that, it affects them. There's high mortality. Nest site disturbance is very problematic. Flowerless landscapes, of course, people like to have their clean and green lawns, which they think look beautiful. They like that aesthetic, but to an insect, that's like a dead zone. There's no value from that kind of lawn, from that habitat. Habitat fragmentation is a huge problem. When you think insects, they really can't fly very far, right? They're a really small creature, excluding the monarch, which has that insane long migration. Most of our insects, they don't really travel very far. They're small-bodied creatures, and they're built to stay close. So it's really important for them to have all of their resources at a pretty close distance so they don't have to work too hard to get to them. Habitat loss, huge problem for all of our wildlife, including insects. Pathogens, diseases are becoming really problematic. Climate change, that's a more recent issue, but proving to be one of the big ones. We have this mismatched phenology where flowers are blooming before the insects have emerged, vice versa. The insects are emerging earlier than when the flowers are blooming. So that's becoming very problematic. And then from a bee perspective, there's research suggesting that we have this competition from honeybees for resources that's becoming detrimental to native bees. So again, like I said, there's not one thing in particular that I would say is causing loss. It's a combination of all of these factors that are causing declines in a lot of our insects and our populations. So circling back to Dr. Tallamy, he had some really profound words that if insects were to disappear, most flowering plants would go extinct, which would change the physical structure and energy flow of most terrestrial habitats, which would cause the rapid collapse of the food webs that support amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The biosphere would not rot due to the loss of insect decomposers, and humanity would be doomed. So those are really startling words, very true words, but I don't want to end on that note when there are things that we can do to support our populations. So one of the first things you can do is provide shelter. Insects need shelter to rest, breed, nest, travel, and feed. So remember I talked about these are small-bodied creatures, so they don't travel very far, which means they have to have what they need in pretty close proximity. So this is a project up here in the right-hand corner that I was working on actually for the city of Raleigh, and they had a huge amount of acreage, and this is how they were keeping it. So does that look like it would be sustainable from an insect perspective? There is nothing that is here as an offering for an insect or really any wildlife to survive. Even as a travel corridor, that offers no protection. But what about down here? That has safe travel corridor, that has forage, that has areas where they can nest. There's a little creek right here. So this is what we like to see. And I really like this diagram because it shows the varying levels of habitat. The trees, down to the shrubs, down to the perennials, down to the ground cover and the vines, all really important things. We like to have a diverse habitat. We don't want to have just perennials, right? Or we don't want to have just trees. We like to have a wide diversity of all different things because we have so many different types of insects that like to use so many different kinds of things. So if we only have perennials, there's going to be winners and losers. But if we have all of these things in our landscape, then hopefully we're going to have all winners. All right, how about providing forage? So it's really important to remember that insects are active, usually coming to be about now, mid-February, all the way through November in North Carolina. When we start getting, I heard that we are getting into the 60s next week. So if we have some continued days of 60s, some insects might think that it's time to start waking up, but there is nothing in bloom. So we hope that those insects hang on a little bit longer until at least March. But it's really important to have forage available for them in spring, summer, and fall. We've talked a lot about these different insects, and I guess one thing I didn't mention is that different species of bees and butterflies and wasps, they're active at all different times of the growing season. So I mentioned those bee burrows, right, that you might see in the spring. A lot of those species of mining bees are only active above the ground in the spring. And then they go back, the females that create new burrows, they lay new eggs, those females die, and then the rest of the year, those larvae underground are developing. But then in the summer, we have a lot of sweat bees that are active. And it's the same with butterflies. They have different flight windows, and it's the same with wasps. They have different times of the year that they're active. And why does that make sense? If everything were active all at once, would we run out of food for all of the insects? We sure would. So we have to have kind of this varying stage of activity so that there's always enough food for all of these different insects to consume. So again, really important to have forage all throughout the year. And I find it's the hardest, I think, in nurseries to find spring blooming plants that are native. You can go to Lowe's or some of the big box stores and you can find some non-native things that will be blooming, but it's really important in the spring to find things just because when these insects emerge from their diapause or their hibernation, they're really hungry. They want to eat. So the first thing that they're looking for is usually forage. So really important to have that source for them. We always talk about not all plants are created equal. Some plants have much higher quality pollen and nectar value to it. There's a lot of debate between cultivars and native species, and some cultivars I think might be okay, but other cultivars, they don't have, as an example, the leaf value that some caterpillars want versus the straight native species. I was just looking at a nursery that had, I think it was black gum, which is a host plant for a lot of different Lepidoptera, and it was a cultivar. And so the leaves were this weird shade of red. And I asked the nursery owner, well, have you ever seen caterpillars? And she's like, no, I've never seen them on the leaves. And I'm like, I bet it's because they're not the straight native leaves. They taste different, or they look different, or there's some different component. And the moths and the butterflies aren't using them for laying eggs. So always important if you can to go for the straight native. Choose local ecotypes and species appropriate to your region. I live in the Sandhills in North Carolina, so what's going to work for me is probably not going to work where you guys are up in Wake County or even in California or in Virginia. You want to choose species that are appropriate for the actual area where you live. If possible, determine if those seeds and plants are pesticide free. If you go to a local nursery, a lot of those plants are grown on site, and you can ask the owners, have you treated your seeds with neonicotinoids? Have you sprayed XYZ pesticide on your plant? And they should be able to tell you. Little known fact is that because fire ants are considered invasive and detrimental, when a plant comes into North Carolina from another state, by law, it has to be sprayed with a chemical to eradicate any fire ants on there. Even if there are no fire ants on there, just by law, on the chance that there are fire ants on there, it has to be sprayed. So to me, I automatically want to go to a local nursery just to make sure I'm buying a plant that was grown on site, that wasn't flown in from Florida or Oklahoma, or that would have to be sprayed by some pesticide. All right, so providing nesting habitat, another really important component. So wetlands at all costs are really valuable areas of habitat for lots of different types of insects, the water source, the plant diversity, the detritus. Wetlands are really, really critical areas, so always protect wetlands if you have them. We talked about bare ground for bees, the cicada killer. I mentioned that they nest in the ground. All of these insects, they need bare ground. If you have lawn with really thick thatch, bees and wasps and different insects, they cannot chew through that usually. They need to have this open bare ground. So it's really important if you want to attract insects to the ground to have that easy access for them. Fallen logs is really important. I visited a garden and I told Kara this, and I can't remember if she told me what chapter. I think she probably did, but I visited a garden in Raleigh a couple of years ago that was maintained by an NCWF chapter. And it was this beautiful little pollinator garden. But what really struck me that I was so impressed with, that in their garden, they had a piece of a log that was there intentionally to show how important it is to have these fallen logs as habitat. Because beetles, once the wood gets nice and soft, beetles will bore into the fallen wood and they'll use that. But then when they leave that hole, when they no longer need it, guess what goes in behind the beetles? The bees, the wasp, all of those cavity nesters that we talked about. So a lot of different things use these fallen logs once the wood gets nice and soft and easy for it to be excavated. So really important if you can leave fallen logs on your property, if you can safely leave snags, standing snags, those have a lot of value as well. Bee houses, there's a little bit of controversy over bee houses, kind of like there's controversy over bird feeders, right? If you can keep your bird feeder clean, then there's value to that. It's the same with these bee houses. If you can keep them clean, then there's value to that. But you have to remember that these little tubes, they collect bacteria, germs, disease, just like anything else that's sitting out for a while, being exposed to the elements and a lot of different things using it. So if you are able to replace these little tubes annually, then that's a good way to go. If you just leave them sitting year after year, then they're going to collect bacteria, and that could be dangerous to whatever insect is using it. Another thing that people don't often think about that I've seen videos of, because we have predatory wasps that will insert their ovipositor and lay eggs in these little tubes. I've seen videos of these predatory wasps going from hole to hole to hole, inserting eggs in all of these little bee burrows. So, that wasp probably thought, this is the best day ever. This is like a buffet. I have all these places where I can parasitize, and great for the wasp, but less great for the bees. So something to think about. If you can create habitat in a more natural way, for instance, the fallen log, if you can leave standing stems in the fall and the winter, that's really critical too. A lot of times in the fall, or early winter, once the birds have gotten all the seeds off of these stems, I'll go and I'll clip the top of these stems and I'll leave it as an open burrow opportunity for bees that are coming out in the spring. So I find that it's fun to watch the bee houses, but I find the standing stems and the fallen logs better habitat for some of our native insects. And so here we are in the winter, not fall anymore. And I always talk about how important it is to maintain that fall and winter habitat because, like I mentioned before, we do have some migratory insects, but most of our insects stay here with us in the winter. They overwinter. And so leaving the leaves on the ground, really important because that's where a lot of the insects hang out. They use the leaves kind of as their winter blankets. I had a huge fritillary bust, or not bust, but I just had a huge amount of fritillaries in the fall, Gulf and variegated, and I must have 25 different chrysalids right now in various parts of my yard just because I had such a big boom of fritillaries, and they're just all hanging out with me in the wintertime. And a lot of butterflies and moths will do that. They'll overwinter with us. So it's really important to try to leave your yard. We always say a messy yard is a great place for wildlife. People don't tend to like that messy look. So we put up signage that say that we've left the leaves, leave the leaves, that we have pollinator habitat that we're supporting so that your neighbors know that you're doing that intentionally, if you're worried about that. What about prescribed fire? So I mentioned I live in the Sandhills, and in longleaf pine, which is the habitat we have down here, prescribed fire is a must. This is a fire dependent community, and in lots of other areas of the state, fire is really, really important. It opens the canopy and it stimulates new growth. And in areas that have become really choked up with a lot of different hardwoods, it's important to get that fire on the ground so that it opens up the canopy, because when that happens, sunlight hits the ground. And when sunlight hits the ground, all of those flowers start to bloom, all those plants start to develop. And that's what we need to support our insects. So prescribed fire, pretty important if you're able to do it safely and comfortably. And something that we always emphasize is that if you're able to do small burns, that's better. And you rotate those burns so that you keep insect refugia. So this is here on Sandhills Game Lands. We had this very patchy burn, which is great because we were able to burn a large area, but we also left these little patches of habitat so that we had refugia for the insects that lived in that area. So there are ways to create small burn blocks or create patchy burns so that you're always preserving some component of the insect population. All right, practicing pesticide stewardship. This one is tricky, right? Because we don't necessarily want to have pesticides, but there's really no line dividing us from our neighbors. So if you can, we always encourage seeking alternative ways of controlling those pests and weeds. As an example, for mosquitoes, Doug Tallamy, he has these great videos where he talks about creating this bucket where you fill it up with water and you put hay in it, and then you put a mosquito dunk in it. So you're attracting the female mosquitoes to lay their eggs in here. And then as soon as the eggs hatch, they die. And it's not hopefully attracting anything else. So you're not getting any bykill. So that's a really good way to alleviate the mosquito problems you have in your yard without eliminating all the other really important insects. This is a really good one. Looking here at this image, there are so many places in your yard that can support mosquito populations. I did a presentation one time and I went around my yard, which I just live on a little 3/4 acre lot, and I took pictures of all the places where there was just a little bit of water. Mosquitoes only need a tablespoon of water to lay eggs. So just a tiny amount of water. I could not believe how many places in my yard I had some water where mosquitoes could lay eggs. So I think it's really important to do that, to go around your yard, especially after some recent rain, and see where there might be little puddles of water that could attract those mosquitoes. And then if you are spraying, or spraying is happening in your neighborhood or around your landscape, there are some things that you can do to kind of minimize the impact. So as an example, spray when insects are less active, which is usually earlier in the morning or later in the afternoon. Obviously spray when there's either no wind or very little wind, and then spray when the bloom period is minimal, because then at least you're avoiding a lot of those nectaring insects. So this is one of my favorite things to do. There are so many great reference books. There are so many books that have so much good information so that you can learn about all of these species. You can learn about the beneficial insects. Here's one of Doug Tallamy's books, Nature's Best Hope. You can learn about all of the amazing diversity of caterpillars in your backyard. You can learn about the bees, because once you learn about those things, then you can be an advocate for those species, and you can teach your neighbors, or you can teach your kids, or you can teach your friends about all of these different components and why they're so important, and their different life cycles and their different life stages, and what you can do to support them. And once you have that information, then you can become an advocate. And then it's not just me talking to you about how beneficial insects are, it's you talking to your neighbors and to so many other people that I might not be able to reach. So probably the most important thing that I think you can do is become an advocate for the environment, become an advocate for all the insects in your yard just by learning about them. And like I said, there's no shortage of really amazing reference books now that you can look at to learn more. And, you know, I've been chasing bees and wasps for years and years, but it's amazing how many things that you can still learn, even when you've been doing it for a long time. It's really fascinating. Insects are so interesting and so beneficial in our environment. So, learn about them, teach about them, share that excitement with other people. That's the best thing that you can do. And with that, that is my contact information. So if you are interested in learning more about the community science project I mentioned with the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, or if you have some cool pictures that you took in your yard and you don't know what the insect was, shoot them to me. If you just want to talk about insects, I'm your gal. I could talk about insects for days and days. So I'd love to chat. If you want to send me an email or shoot me a text or give me a call, happy to chat. And I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has some.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't know how you can't love pollinators after that presentation. Thank you so much. I loved the I never heard of nectar being described as an energy drink, and I think that's fantastic. And yes, there's a wonderful pollinator garden that Gabriella was mentioning at Forest Ridge Park, which is a City of Raleigh park in the northeastern part of Wake County, that has a great pollinator habitat maintained by the Neuse River Hawks Conservationists, which is our chapter in Wake Forest. They've thought of really cool different ways to show not only the wood needs, but so many other different needs that pollinators have. So go, it's a great walk if you're looking for an excuse once the weather gets warmer. All right, so we do have some questions coming in here. When you were talking about the American burying beetle, excuse me, Jane said that she found two American carrion beetles on a stinkhorn fungi in Durham.
Oh, very
So
cool.
very interesting. And Sissy asked, do we know why those beetles are disappearing or so endangered?
Yeah, so it's kind of like what I said before. It's death by a thousand cuts. So it's really hard to trace the decline of some of these populations to one thing in particular. But one thing that scientists have noticed about the American burying beetle, light pollution, because it's a nocturnal beetle, light pollution is causing a lot of problems because it's disorienting the beetle from moving in the way it needs to. It's making it more of a target because it's making it more visible to nighttime predators that might be looking for. Because remember, I said it's a pretty substantially sized beetle. So the biggest thing that it has going for it is the cover of night. Especially when they're moving long distances to find the carcasses. So I think that habitat loss is surely a big one, but the night pollution seems to be what scientists are really thinking is problematic. And unfortunately, that's problematic for a lot of other nighttime insects. It's not just the burying beetle, but moths, fireflies. There are a lot of problems associated with that we're trying to figure out. There's some, if you want to have your nights on at light, there's some dimmer light bulbs that you can use that aren't as attractive to some of these nighttime insects. But, a lot of people, they want to have nights on or lights on all through the night. And it always attracts a lot of insects, and it can deter them from doing what they need to be doing, whether it's breeding or eating or moving. And so that's a hard thing to work past, right? People like to have their lights on. So again, you can advocate for these species and maybe talk to your neighbor or your HOA and let them know, hey, your lights on at night are really detrimental to a lot of species, and just educate them on why it might be important to turn off their lights.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing. We have some plant-related questions. I'm just going through everything from the earliest question I got to the ones that are starting to come in now. So there were a couple of questions about some good sources for early spring pollinators. So what are some good plants for early spring time? Certainly spring ephemerals are some good ones, but what other spring plants are good recommendations for pollinators?
Spring ephemerals are really good sources. Something that's really valuable in the spring are, if your landscape can support it, are trees, maple trees, willow trees. If you have areas where there can be wet feet, those are some of our most important sources, just because they bloom so much earlier than some of the perennials do. And they have, remember I was talking about that really high quality pollen and nectar value, and they're also host plants. Cherry, prunus trees, anything in the genus Prunus, they're usually spring bloomers. They host a huge number of Lepidoptera. They have really high value pollen and nectar. So that's a really good thing too to have on your landscape. Far as perennials, what I normally tell people to do, because there are certainly some species that you can look for, like Baptisia, lupin, Amsonia. But the best thing to do, just because it can be really hard to find these certain plants, right? I might look for Baptisia wild indigo in 5 different places and not be able to find it. So it really kind of comes down to the availability of what some of these nurseries have. So in Wake County, if you live in Wake County, there are several really nice native nurseries in Durham County and Wake County. Chatham County has, I think, 4, maybe 5 native plant nurseries. So what I would do, and this is something I have done, is I've gone to the websites of these nurseries, and they usually post inventories, and I'll see what they have available in the spring. And that kind of dictates what I'll buy, just because, I might want to have Amsonia till I'm blue in the face, but if none of the nurseries are carrying it, then I have to shift to be able to find, depending on what's available. But I think in North Carolina, over the last 15 years, we've gotten really fortunate, because there have been quite a few native plant nurseries that have popped up that provide some really nice sources of plants for us. And again, a lot of them are locally grown, or they are maybe transported. I know Carolina Nursery in the mountains, they'll ship a lot of their plants to some of the nurseries in the Piedmont, but they're still within that state boundary confines, so you don't have to worry about them being sprayed. So, and then you have things like the NC Botanical Garden plant sale. They have a sale in May, and they have one in September. So you could go in September to their sale and really stock up on some plants that are spring bloomers, so that by the following spring, they're really well rooted and established, and they should pop out in the spring. And the nice thing too about these native nurseries is that a lot of the staff on site are very knowledgeable. So they can give you input on what are some good species for your particular neck of the woods, whether it be Piedmont or Sandhills or Coastal Plain. And they can help you to figure out what species would be good spring blooming species versus fall blooming species, which is also important, because you have a lot of these insects that are getting ready to go into diapause, and they're stocking up, they're trying to bulk up. So fall blooming species are also important.
And while we're talking about plants, got a question about native vines. What are some good vines for pollinators?
So coral honeysuckle is a really good vine, and that's a spring blooming vine, speaking of spring blooming plants, and it attracts our hummingbird. Trumpet creeper, I love purple passion flower. And if I could look at the audience right now, I am fairly certain that I would see a lot of people groaning because purple passion flower is one of those vines that doesn't play super well with other things. But the flowers, when they're in bloom, attract so many things. And like I said, fritillaries use it as a host plant. I had a huge boom of fritillaries this past fall, more than I've ever had. I must have had over 100 caterpillars at one time. So I love purple passion flower. You just have to put it in an area where it kind of can be free to be its own self, because it does try to take over. Some people think it's invasive. It's not. It's native, but it's just really happy.
It's indeed. Sharing a couple of resources, people have talked about North Carolina Native Plant Society has some nice native plant handouts. I'll share some of those out as well. Bloom calendars, those kinds of things. And then somebody was typing in a book recommendation for Night Magic, which is I haven't read it myself, but I've heard really good things about Night Magic. So I'll share that one out as well. And then somebody also shared a great resource for comparing Chinese mantids to Carolina mantids, so that you can see those side by side to be able to tell the difference, especially on their egg casings, because that's another easy way to kind of tell the difference there. All right, so
I wanted to say, I
yeah,
want
go
to say
ahead.
too, Kara, really quick, because I just I flashed back two of the books that I put up are about attractive native pollinators, and it talks about some of the plants that are really good to put for that attract different species different times a year. And a book that I haven't put on here that is one of my new favorite books is called Gardening for Moths, just because I am so obsessed with moths. And this book, it has more of a Midwestern focus. However, there is a lot of overlap in the plants that they suggest that you could use here in the Southeast. So Gardening for Moths is the name of the book, and it is all about the different plants that you can put in the ground to attract moths to your yard. So Xerces has some really good books. The NC Native Plant Society, like you mentioned, they have some good resources. They also have a list of all of the native plant nurseries in the state. So that's a great resource as well.
Absolutely. And then it got a question about the solitary bee mounds that we see in the early springtime. I think those are probably the females coming in. There's a lot of activity around those mounds. Is that the adult bees that are going in to kind of provision the eggs, or is that the young bees emerging?
So that's the adult bees that are going in. But what happens, even though these are solitary bees, they aggregate because, safety in numbers. So they don't ever share, or they really rarely share burrows. We do have some sweat bees in the summertime that show like a tiny microcosm of social behavior. But for the most part, they're all solitary, but they all create their burrows in close proximity for safety in numbers. And what happens is that the males from the past season, the males that have finished developing and that are emerging as adults, they emerge a little bit earlier than the females do. So they'll come up and they will fly and hover over all of those burrows, waiting for the females to come up. So as soon as the female emerges, they can be the first one to mate with them, to breed with them. And that's what causes some of the human frenzy, because they see all of those bees kind of hovering, and some of these aggregations are hundreds and hundreds of bees, again solitary but aggregates. And so when all of these males are hovering over all of these burrows, that tends to cause a lot of people to get really upset and freaked out.
And while we're talking about these ground nesting bees, do any native bees have issues with tunneling in clay? I definitely notice a lot of bees in areas that are open and clear around clay. And there was a question about if they have any issue with compacted clay.
So most solitary bees, ground nesting bees, they tend to prefer well-drained, sandy type soil. So if it's really compacted, they're probably not going to like that as much, just because if you think about it, it's this tiny little bee and they have mandibles, and they're strong for the size of that bee, but in the grand scheme of things, they're only a tiny little insect and there's only so much that they can excavate and dig through. So really compacted clay is probably going to be really hard for them to excavate through. So I wouldn't imagine that you would see a lot of activity if you had a really compacted site.
And then, speaking of shelter and habitat for bees, there was a question about when to kind of change out the tubes if you do have a bee hotel or any of those other types of created habitat for bees. When is a good time to clean those out?
I would do it annually. So this is where you kind of have to keep an eye. So there is something called an emergence box. So you can, because we have different species of bees using these bee hotels all through the season, right? So there might be some mason bees from the spring that are using it, but then there might be some different types of bees in the summer, some leaf cutting bees in the summer and the fall using it. So how do you track that emergence? And so there's this thing called an emergence box that you can put your bee hotel into, and it only has one opening, and it's translucent, and this one opening lets in the light. And so when the bees emerge, they go towards that opening and they'll leave. And new bees that are looking to create nests, they don't usually come in that hole because it's a really small hole. So it's more of an exit than an entrance, if that makes sense. So as the bees are emerging from those tubes, they'll find that hole and they will exit. And then once everything has exited from your bee hotel, then you can replace all of the tubes. It is something to try to do annually, just because there have been a lot of studies that shown that it collects a lot of bacteria and disease accumulates and things of that nature.
All right, Monty. I see Monty's got his hand raised. He's got a question. He's been very patient.
No problem. I'm glad everybody's participating. First of all, Gabrielle, this has been wonderful, and I think your title is so apropos, the unsung heroes, that you've really opened up the world of insects to us, and it is amazing. It is absolutely amazing, and we wouldn't be here without them, right?
Yep.
I was curious that your statistics at the beginning, you talked about 91,000 documented insect species in the US, 1.5 million in the world. That means we only have like 6% of the insect species in the United States. Is that seems low? I wonder why that is. Do you have any idea?
Well, I mean, if you think about where the real concentration of insects are, it's places like Central America, South America, closer to the equator, where there's the climate, the temperate zones that really sustains that diversity year round. So even in the United States, in North Carolina, I mentioned we have 550-ish species of native bees. That's actually on the low end. So it seems like a really high number, but when you put it in point of reference to, for instance, California, which has 1,500 species of bees, it really, there's even a pretty wide gradient of diversity in the United States. And it all really comes down to the habitat that's available. So if you think about Central America, if you go into the rainforest and you see the diversity of plants and flowers and that climate, which is warm and really wet, that's going to sustain a lot more insect diversity than our climate here, which we have harsh-ish winters. And, our diversity, our plant diversity, it's nice. I mean, we have some really cool plants here, but compared to the rainforest or
Yeah.
some more temperate places like the Philippines, they have a really amazing diversity too. I think it's just point of reference for what habitat is available for those insects. I went to Costa Rica a couple of years ago and I found this amazingly beautiful moth on the wall of one of the hotels where we were staying. And I went to ask a local if they knew what species it was. And he kind of laughed at me and he was like, "Oh, I think it's one of the Saturnid moths." And I said, "Oh, you don't know the species?" And he looked at me and I think he was trying to be nice. And he's like, "We have over 11,000 species of moths here. So no, I don't know what this one species of moth is." So that puts our little 2,800 species of moths, to rest, because Costa Rica is a really small little country. 11,000 species of moths. It's amazing. The diversity is just different, I think, based on the habitat that's available and the climate.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I wonder if I could sneak in a second question if the moderator will let me.
Yes, I'll allow
I,
it.
I got one more, which is it possible? Because I was really intrigued by these beneficial predatory insects. Is it possible or advisable to introduce them in your yard, like for instance the green lacewing to control aphids?
Yeah, as long as it's a native insect that's supposed to be there. Because honestly, Monty, I don't know why there wouldn't be green lacewings in your yard, you know? My only problem with introduced predators are, like, as an example, there was, and I think they're still available. You can buy them on Amazon. These lady beetles, ladybugs that are Western species
Oh,
that have
yeah,
been introduced to the Eastern species and causing a lot of problems. I mean, bugs need to stay where they're supposed to stay.
right.
You know, one reason is that there aren't the native predators here to control these bugs like there are in California and in the Rocky Mountains. And so I think as long as it's an insect that naturally occurs in Wake County, which green lacewings would, I think that's totally fine. They're fantastic predators, and the larvae are voracious, which I love.
Yeah, I just haven't seen them, but I'd love to have them come visit. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question about carpenter bees and
Mm.
chewing into houses or wood or
Mhm.
other places where you don't want them. Is there a way to divert them? Any advice on carpenter bees?
So that's a great question. And we get that question a lot. And I'll tell you something that somebody has, or several people had mentioned to me. I haven't tried it because I don't want to deter carpenter bees in my yard. But something that several people have mentioned is that you can buy online fake wasp nest, or like the hanging wasp nest, or you can get a brown paper bag and kind of craft your own wasp nest, like what would be the equivalent of a paper wasp nest, and you can hang it in strategic places around your houses. And some people swear by this, that it makes the carpenter bees leave, it deters them. Other people say it doesn't work, but if that's something you want to try, it's a pretty cheap way to see if it'll work. Um, there have been at NC State, there's a lot of ongoing research to figure out what carpenter bee preferences are, because some people say they won't go towards treated wood. Well, that's not true. They'll go to treated wood in a second. So some people think that they might have a specific wood preference. I'm not sure yet if that's been noticed, but one of the things that NC State was doing is that they made these benches of several different types of wood, and some were treated and some were untreated, and they were putting them in various spots around the triangle to see if they could figure out what carpenter bee preferences were, so they could tell homeowners, avoid this kind of wood. You don't want this kind of wood. And this is ongoing, because sometimes it can take a while for carpenter bees to find certain things. I noticed in my yard, I had a sign in my yard, on a post of cedar wood that had a leave the leaves sign so that people wouldn't get mad at my messy yard. And the carpenter bees went into that immediately. And so I don't mind that they're in my back deck and my front porch, but I did find that very interesting that I put that post of wood out there to hang my sign on, and they went into that immediately. So I've been suggesting that as a possibility to people: get posts of cedar because it's a nice soft wood, and put them sort of in instrumental areas or strategic locations around your yard to see if you can draw them away to that specific kind of wood, or make your own experiment and get maybe a cedar post and a different kind of wooden post, and see if you can figure out if there's a type of wood that they might like. It's an ongoing question. The other thing that they're doing at NC State is trying to figure out if there's a way to determine the length of time that carpenter bees can be in your back deck or in your home without causing structural issues. You know, like if it's okay for them to be in your back deck for 10 years, but there's no structural concerns. You know, those are things too that they're trying to determine. I will say, I have to put in a plug for carpenter bees. They're really good pollinators. I have a picture, and actually, I think I had it in my presentation early on, of a carpenter bee that was just covered in pollen from head to toe. They love to visit the plant, the flower on purple passion flower. So they get a bad rap. They do some gnarly damage sometimes in houses, but if there's a way to figure out how to draw them away from your house by trying some of those different wooden posts, I say give it a try. If you learn something, let me know. Communicate those results to NC State too, because we're all trying to figure out the answers. What I would definitely recommend against, though, I see people use those carpenter bee traps all the time, like those glass mason jars where the carpenter bee goes in the top and then they drop down to the mason jars and they just kind of languish. If you're going to do that, I would say collect some carpenter bees over the length of a day or two and maybe relocate them somewhere else so that they're not just languishing to death in the mason jars. That just seems so cruel to me.
I'll see one more question in the chat and then we'll kind of call it a night, unless I see any other questions, any last questions. But there was someone was interested when you were talking about the light pollution affecting some beetles. Are there any wavelengths of light for any certain insects that are better than others, or amber lights, or just dimming lights, or having them off is the best way to go?
So that's a great question. I don't know the answer about the wavelength, and I'm certain that there probably is a certain wavelength that's better. You know, the best scenario is going to be to have your lights off or have motion lights that only come on when there's some kind of motion detected in your yard and then they go off, they turn off on their own volition. I think that's the best way. And I think that makes people feel secure because there's still a light if there's somebody moving around in their yard. But then if once the movement goes away, then the lights turn off again. That seems like a good compromise. And there's definitely dimmer lights that you can install that that don't have that attractive value. They're not as bright, and so there aren't nearly as many insects that tend to go to those lights just because they're so dim. But they still cast enough illumination in your yard that it gives people a sense of security. So that seems to be a good compromise if you have to have a light on. But I think ultimately the best scenario is having no lights.
That makes sense. All right. Well, thank you so much. There's lots of comments in the chat about how wonderful and articulate you were. So thank you so much again. This was really great. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you learned something. I certainly did. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Like I said, if anybody wants to reach out, please feel free to do so. Happy to chat.
Go do the Bumblebee Atlas.
Yes, yes. Please reach out if you want to learn more about bumblebees. I'll tell you, like I said, it's a citizen science project, and we rely on folks just like you to help us get more information about bumblebees.
Thanks, Gabriela.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good
Good
night.
night, everyone.